again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for the introduction. I want to sort of preface what I'm going to say by saying that, you know, what I'm going to offer you guys right now are lessons on lessons from my own experience, from the experience of people that I've worked with, on how we might be able to work to make our own Muslim community more of an anti-racist space. And I say this in particular because a lot of the conversations that we have about racism in the Muslim community are like, the racism is over here and the Muslims are over here, and how can we help fight the racism, right? But that's not, like, Muslim communities are part of a larger American society, and that means that we have a lot of the problems that our larger American society has too. And so I want to address this in particular to, I would say, non-Black Muslims, but this is, I think, a thinking space for all of us, and I actually invite you guys, if this is okay, invite you guys in the Q&A part of the app, if you want to drop reflections, particularly for the Black folks among us, if you want to drop reflections about how we can make these spaces more inclusive, that's more than welcome. Maybe just put a couple of asterisks before you drop something so that we can distinguish between the questions and the not questions. Yes. Okay, cool. So I want to run through sort of 5 different things, and I want us to think about ourselves. Obviously, each of us are individuals, but we also exist in community with other people, right? And so I'm going to run through 5 different sort of things that we need to think about, starting with you as an individual and sort of going outwards to, you know, and again, in the context of the Muslim community in particular. And so the first one is probably one that you guys have heard pretty often, right? Which is we need to undertake personal reflection. We need to think about what is our own personal commitment to anti-racism. We often talk about in the Muslim community racism as a disease of the heart, and it is, right? And we need to there are so many resources in our tradition on how we can purify our heart from the diseases of the heart. But I also want to talk about it as a disease of the heart that creates social systems and patterns that we can be complicit in without even knowing, right? So my first question for all of you guys is what forms of racism have you internalized? What are the patterns that you undertake, whether they're thought patterns, whether they're action patterns, right, that may further sort of racist structures? What are your community's patterns? And I want to invite you in this moment in particular, the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative has an anti-racism self-assessment tool. So you can find that on their website, and you know that's, I think, an opportunity for you guys to do further inquiry after this. But in particular, I want you guys to think about, again, your patterns, but how do we move from being non-racist to being anti-racist, right? We don't just want to be people who don't do harm. We want to be people who make things better, right? And so let's think, so part of what I want you guys to think about as you think about your own personal, your patterns, and as well as your own personal commitment is what are you doing that is not only non-racist, right, but also anti-racist? In addition to that, I want you to think about, like, I need you to think about your humility in this context, right? Like, are you actually, and particularly, again, non-Black Muslim folks, are you actually listening to the people who are most affected by anti-Blackness in the Muslim community? And if someone were to tell you, hey, you are misunderstanding my experience completely, honestly, how responsive would you be to that? And how much of your initial instinct would be, no, I know better, I've studied XYZ thing, right? So one of the crucial pieces of this is that we have to make sure that we are focused on our humility. And then the last bit of this first part, okay, I need to move faster. Last bit of this first part is, are you willing to take risks and make mistakes? Solidarity is an active practice. Who is holding you accountable in your community, right? And how are you holding yourself accountable in these situations? Okay, that's the first one. The second one is your ethnic community, right? So what is it like, so my family's Libyan, so I could think about Libyans, I could think about Arab Americans in general. And what are the specific historical dynamics that exist in your particular sub-community of the Muslim community, right? That are specific forms of race or racism, right? Because race doesn't look the same in every country. It looks different from place to place. So for example, something that I've talked to my grandparents about a lot is the use of the Ain word. Which is an Arabic word that means slave, that is often used to describe Black people, right? That's a specific form of racism that manifests in Arab society, right? So what are the things that are particular to your ethnic background? This is a thing that requires intergenerational work, right? It requires you actually engaging with older people in your community. You don't get to just decide that they're too old to change, right? And that is about like what, the fact of what is the cultural context that they're coming from, and how does that cultural context feed larger anti-Blackness in the Muslim community? Okay, third one, our relationships. Like when you think about your friend group in the Muslim community, how many Black people are in that friend group? Right? Like, if you think about your masjid, like how many Black people go to your masjid? How many Black Muslims, like what are the connections between your ethnic, whatever community, your masjid that you go to, and maybe a majority Black masjid across town or something like that, right? We're thinking about like, what are the really profound relationships between ethnic groups within our communities? And this is not just in the context of anti-racism. You don't just invite the Black imam over for Black History Month and then move on, right? Like, what are the genuine relationships that we're building? Not just relationships to learn about anti-racism from, but also because we are Muslims and we exist in community with each other, right? And I want to emphasize here that there's immigrant Black Muslims, and that's an important element of this. And then there's also African Muslims who are Black Muslims who are descendants of slaves, right? Descendants of enslaved people. And I want to, we love to invoke like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali and all of these people, but if you are not actually in community with the descendants of those Muslims, then you don't get to invoke that tradition. You don't get to invoke that history, right? And so I really want to emphasize that we need to think about the connections that we are building outside of our own ethnic groups. That might mean outside of your own masjid. Maybe it means within your own masjid, right? But really thinking about, again, for non-Black Muslims in particular, who is it around you? Like, who are the Black Muslims in your community, and why are they not there? So the fourth part, and this gets to the why are they not, sorry, I'm trying to go as fast as I can. The fourth part, and this gets to the question of why are they not there, is that it's like we'd like to talk about racism like it's an interpersonal problem. Like it's like the racist auntie at the masjid, right? But actually there are structures within the Muslim community that systematically exclude Black Muslims, right? And so one example that I'll give you, and there's a really good episode of Code Switch, which is a podcast that focuses on this in particular. But in cities like Chicago or Minneapolis, you have a lot of Arab Americans and Muslim who are generally Muslim, who own liquor stores in majority Black communities. And they make money off of these communities, right? They make money selling poison, essentially, right, to these communities without building any sort of like sustainable relationship with the community, without even knowing like who their clientele is, right? That is not only like non-Islamic, like we're not out here to sell alcohol, right? But it's also just like that is not responsible stewardship and being in community with people. That's a real structural barrier, right? And that's sort of a pattern across big cities in the United States. Also, this covers issues across race, but like the masjid board, like who gets to plan events? Who sits on that? And how do you even decide who sits on that? Is it the Arab uncles bringing their friends in every year, right? Or is it actually a participatory process that engages the body of the masjid? Resource allocation, who's getting funding? You go to some of the oldest masajids in this country, and they are like worn down, falling apart, right? And it's because they're Black Muslim masajid, and because we're fundraising to add like a cafe to the suburban masjid out there, instead of focusing on like what are the actual, where is our history, and like what are the masajid that really need these resources? And what ends up happening is that like a lot of these communities end up having to seek resources elsewhere, which ends up being a problem with programs like the Countering Violent Extremism program, because communities have to go to these sources of funding rather than internal community sources of funding. And I think there's a bunch of these. We need to think about what languages are we providing in our masjid, right? There's like class lines. What services are we providing in our masjid? Marriage services. How many of you guys have filled out marriage forms that ask you what race you are, like in these matrimonial services? Like there's so many things, right? And then another big one in a local masjid of mine is law enforcement presence. Like if you're having a law enforcement appreciation dinner, like who is supposed to feel safe in your masjid, right? And I want to emphasize that there's a growing body of resources. Muslim Arc in particular has a lot of resources for masajid who want to think through these things, whether they're trainings, assessments, toolkits, all sorts of things. But there's all these structural barriers that we don't even see, right? Because maybe they don't affect you, like you individually or whatever. And we need to start having conversations about those, to really think about those structural pieces. And then the last one, which is the shortest one, is reframing what even counts as a Muslim issue. I remember there was a very, very popular sort of American Muslim imam, who I won't name, who was talking about Black Lives Matter and was like, oh, these kids are like going out to protest instead of focusing on, you know, themselves and their families. And I was like, who are you to decide that Black Lives Matter is not about your family? Like that is a very particular idea of what a Muslim American family is, right? This idea that Black Lives Matter is external to the family, right? And so I think we need to reshape these things. So many forms of current sort of Islamophobic anti-Muslim policies, such as the Countering Violent Extremism programs that I mentioned earlier, specifically target Black Muslim young people, right? Specifically target Somali youth. If you look at Minneapolis, if you look at Boston. A lot of entrapment, post-9/11 entrapment cases over the last 20 years have focused particularly on poor, vulnerable Black Muslims to entrap them, right? So there's so many overlaps between war on terror policing that we think about as a Muslim issue and just like terrible racist policing in general. And we really need to be able to expand how we think of Muslim issues because the policies that affect Muslims today have roots in anti-Black policies of whatever the 1960s, as early as like the 1930s. And Black Muslims in that period were characterized as particularly dangerous, right? And that's the legacy that we continue to live with as American Muslims today. And I guess I'll close on that, which is like, again, like anti-Blackness, anti-Black racism is a Muslim issue. It's not an issue of like Black Muslims over there. It's not an issue of like Black people who are over there and the Muslims over here. It is a Muslim issue. These things are connected. Black Muslims are part of our community. Black Muslims established the Muslim community in the United States, right? And it is our responsibility as non-Black Muslims to think about the spaces that we occupy, to think about the patterns that we are recreating, to think about, you know, the community, like the sub-communities that we exist within, and how are we encouraging them and advocating within them to make the Muslim community more inclusive for Black folks, and particularly to continue advocating against these policies that, you know, kill Black people and members of our community. So thank you all so much.